this is where I think we're going to get a little bit of disagreement between you, Dr. Robinson, and you, Dr. Gurry. Is this do text types still have a use? Now, I, Peter, I heard you mention earlier that you don't teach it to your students, and so they're finding out about text types by coming to my YouTube channel here. Uh,
Okay.
let's start with you. I'm guessing you don't see a use for text types anymore. In fact, I don't think CBGM has a use for it. Doesn't really care about text types. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that that was partly what got me onto the question was wrote my dissertation on the CBGM, so I got very familiar with how it works and the results of that method were what were causing, the scholars in Germany, people like Klaus Wachtel to say, look, we don't need these categories anymore. They never quite worked anyway. We certainly should not think in terms of recensions. So Klaus's, his dissertation was a lengthy argument arguing against Westcott and Hort's view that the Byzantine text was the result of a concerted 4th century recension. So his argument, his dissertation, I think, dismantled that view. So he was already predisposed to not liking the view of text types as the result of a particular recension, particular editorial activity. I think the CBGM and its results just kind of pushed him further and made him even more skeptical than he was before. But I think what it also did was made him realize we didn't need them. And that's sort of the big thing and that's kind of where my view would be, is to say, we should really ask the question, are text types even worth it? Like, is it even worth the hassle of trying to nail down a definition of them and what they are? And that's my argument would essentially be, no, they're not. So the way I would put it is something like, why bother with text types? Why do we think we actually need them? What do we need them for? Granted, they're very comfortable. People are familiar with them. And as I said, they make decision-making much easier if, well, I think if you oversimplify them and, if you have these sort of simplistic views of Alexandrian good, Byzantine bad, you know what I mean? Yes, that does make decisions easier, does not make decisions good, but it does make them easier to make. But I would just say, why bother, And here would be my appeal to listeners, okay? Now, your Byzantine listeners, probably this will not impress them, but for reason eclectics, at least, okay? Our major editions do not use text types already. The Tyndale House edition does not make any appeal to text types. I'm told that when their textual commentary comes out, it will not reference text types, okay? The Nestle Aland 28, at least where it's updated, so where it's new, they have not used text types to make their decisions, right? When the Nestle 29 comes out, it'll have updated text in Mark, Acts, maybe Revelation, I guess. And none of those places will have appealed to text types to make the decisions. Okay. Even the SBL Greek New Testament done by Mike Holmes, when I've asked Mike about it, he has said no, he didn't. He has been skeptical of text types for a while as well. And when I asked him at SBL, when I gave my presentation, I said, Mike, would you say that you're a proponent of text types? He said no. So I think even his edition, we should say, and I clarified this, I said, Mike, can I claim that your Greek New Testament is not based on text type? And he said, yes, that's a fair characterization. Okay, so I don't think I'm speaking out of turn. But that's significant. That means your 3 most recent, most significant critical texts on the market, the Tyndale House, the Nestle Aland, and the SBL Greek New Testament, none of them actually do text criticism using text types. So if somebody were to ask me, how do you do text criticism without text types? My answer is people are already doing it.
Right. So
Just
if
look
I
at the
could,
Tyndale edition.
yeah, so if I could just sum up what you're saying here really quickly, you're suggesting it's not that there aren't text types. It's just what you're suggesting is that it's not worth the effort to try and hash them out when we have other tools like CBGM.
Well, I actually think it's both. I don't think there are text types really.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I think even if somebody does think they are, I think, why bother? You don't need them.
Okay.
So
All right.
that's kind of a twofold argument.
Okay, Dr. Robinson, why bother?
Oh, I bother. I recognize the textual clusters exist. Again, I'm not using the terminology text type, but the manuscripts, certain manuscripts generally tend to associate with each other in their own particular groups. I recognize this exists, and what the importance I would see of a textual cluster is, let's say we've got 15 manuscripts that would fit into a cluster you might call Alexandrian. Mm-hmm. And it may be more, it may be less, but the manuscripts within that particular cluster, when they are agreeing over and over again in similar proportions, some may drift out, some may drift back in, but as long as they're agreeing over and over again in similar proportions, I think what it is doing is pointing to an early archetype that was the parent of the reading that now has been spread through that particular grouping of manuscripts. Not necessarily at every single juncture, but at most points where they do associate together. So I see a value in this as pointing to an earlier archetype. And I still don't say that you play the text types off one against another like the older methods were, but recognition of this is just sending the text back further. And this goes in with not only Caldwell, but someone else's very many others who have said basically all of these sensible readings probably go back to a period before 200 AD. And from that point, the archetypes of these later clusters would have had an origin, some point of origin at that point. Now, is there a use for text types? That's one of the primary uses, I think, to show you that you do have ancient readings that are found in later manuscripts, and later is relative. We're talking about manuscripts even of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries are later than the 2nd century. So they're readings that they cluster around. The more they cluster, then the more likely it's going back to an ancient archetype. If a later manuscript goes off on a singular reading, that is more likely the product of a scribe and has very limited effect, and it probably does not go back to an ancient archetype. So there are uses for text types. And just by the way, even the CBGM people, you're going to get to this question later, but even they agree, like Gerd Mink will say, there's only one text type, and it's the Byzantine. After that, I don't know what you call it, the clusters, but the clusters are out there. And if there's something wrong with calling them clusters, then I would say take that up with Eldon J. Epp, because he's a big promoter of that point. But I do think there are uses, and I just don't say, well, you can dismiss this reading simply because a particular cluster happens to disagree or another cluster agrees or something else. You still have to weigh the readings that are found as readings and then look at what the various cluster weights might be supporting or altering such a reading. There are reasons, but they're not just so you can play off and just say, I'm taking 2 out of 3 text types, which is, for example, what Harry Sturz and David Allen Black do.
That's right, yeah.
You just can't play the text types off that way against each other.
Yeah, Can I jump on that real quick, Dwayne?
No, you're not allowed.
Okay.
Just kidding. Go ahead.
I think Maurice brought up Harry Sturz. I think if listeners want a great example of what not to do, I think actually Sturz's approach is a great example. I don't mean that as some sort of like a way to bash Sturz.
Yeah, that's interesting because I would see his book as like a necessity.
Well, I'm not saying it's not important to read. Yeah. I guess what I mean is his approach of saying where we've got 2 text types against one, we should always go with whatever's found in the 2 text types. That particular approach, I think, is exactly what you should never do with text types.
Right.
Because that requires text types to be independent entities. And that's exactly what I think all of us should agree today. And I think that's what I hear Maurice saying is that's exactly what they are not. They are not these independent entities from each other that you can somehow count and say where I have 2 against 1, the 2 win. They're
Okay,
not those
okay.
kinds of things. They're not, because they're not independent. That would be my argument, is they're not, whatever they are, they're definitely not independent of one another.
Okay. All right.
So
Gotcha. Loud and
you
clear.
can't count them like that and say majority rules.
And by the way, on the Stirr's principle, he's dealing with only 3 text types. It'll be Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. And the trouble is, and I think this is the fallacy of the entire Stirr's approach, if the Alexandrian and Byzantine agree, he goes with that. If the Alexandrian and Western agree, he goes with that. If the Byzantine and Western agree, he goes with that. If you boil it down to the essence, you're allowing the Western text to become the final decider in all cases. And if the Western text is one of the most weakly supported clusters, then it seems very strange that you're allowing such a weak cluster to become your final determining point.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. This segues really nicely into the next question. So in talking about clusters, text types, they're on their way out, according to Dr. Gurry. We're hanging on to clusters, according to Dr. Robinson. But the ECM seems to kind of hang on to text types a little bit, right? They still retain the use of the Byzantine text. So how do you explain this seeming contradiction to your view, Dr. Gurry?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. One I've had to wrestle with, because when Tommy and I wrote our introduction to the CBGM, we had to make sure we were clear with Klaus on this, because I'm not sure we were at first, honestly.
Okay.
I think it's 2 parts. One is, I think that part of what Klaus and others maybe at INTF in Münster are most opposed to about text types is the idea that they are recensions. So Klaus wants to be clear that even the retention of the term Byzantine in the ECM does not mean they think it is something that resulted from one particular person editing the text, and then that takes off, okay, and becomes dominant. Klaus is very clear in his dissertation. He thinks the Byzantine text, as we find it, say, in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century, is the result of a long process. Okay, a long, fairly slow process, because it takes centuries to happen, of development where scribes, individual scribes and correctors, what we call diorthotes, like correctors, okay, preferring basically the same readings over and over again because they all fit this basic tendency to smooth out the text to make it easier. Okay, so why do they use the Byzantine, that particular abbreviation BYZ? I would say it's basically a shorthand. It's a way to represent a bunch of manuscripts and keep the apparatus smaller. So one thing you'll notice when you use the CBGM online, it does not use that ever. You'll never see that BYZ abbreviation. Does that make sense? So in some ways, I would say, well, the fact that they use that abbreviation actually shouldn't think that means they think there is something called the Byzantine text per se. Although, to be sure, they do think there are a whole lot of manuscripts from the Middle Ages that tend to agree at a very high rate. Okay.
Right.
The other way to answer it is just to say the Byzantine text is a bit of an exception. And in fact, I would argue personally, I'm not speaking for them now in any way, I would argue that maybe I should say it different. It's my hunch. Okay, Dwayne, I've not written on this or tried to
Sure.
make the case. Okay, this is a hunch I have. So take it for what it's worth. It's my hunch that the whole notion of text types actually is built around the Byzantine manuscripts. Because I think there's 2 features that the Byzantine manuscripts have that's really what sets them apart and makes them so interesting. One is that there's so many of them, and then the second is that they agree at such a high rate with each other.
Right.
So if you compare something like traditionally the traditional Byzantine text to the traditional Alexandrian text, how many Alexandrian manuscripts do you have? Maybe a dozen or so. Okay. And if you look at their agreement rates are not nearly as high as your typical Byzantine witnesses are with each other, right? So if you were to set the traditional Alexandrian text against the traditional Byzantine text, they'd have 2 things not in common: the number of members There'd be thousands in the Byzantine and only dozens in the Alexandrian. And then the second thing they would not share in common is the rate of agreement. The Byzantine manuscripts in general would share a much higher agreement amongst themselves than those manuscripts that are said to be Alexandrian. To my mind, that's an indication that this whole notion of text types is probably misguided. What we've done is we've had this recognition that there is this interesting, massive group of manuscripts that tend to agree at a really high rate, and we have wanted to have other things to compare to that. And so the Byzantine text, sort of like Mark's Gospel and the Synoptic problem, becomes the common denominator in everybody's sort of theory of how the text develops. We all know there's this thing called the Byzantine text that we kind of can't get around, that's like there, right? And it's startling both in its size and in its level of agreement. And then the temptation is to want to create other groups to sort of compare to it. And my sort of argument would be those other groups probably don't really exist.
It's interesting. Now, if I were to take this video and edit it afterwards and cut out everything before you just said and everything after you just said, I could title the video, Peter Gurry is a Byzantine prioritist, and probably convince a bunch of people on that.
And make more ad dollars, man. Do it.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's all good.
I just want a small cut, Dwayne. I want a small cut.
Yeah, that's right. We'll put you in for 10%. No, but it's interesting because as much as we talk about text types not being much of a thing or even being helpful, I do have to point out that the ECM is finding it helpful to retain the biz word, the lingo there, the formula. So I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Robinson and get your thoughts on the use of biz by the ECM editors.
Well, this is a complicated issue. Peter is correct that it is being used in the ECM as a catch-all term. No question about that. The way to find out what constitutes biz is they do give a list of the manuscripts that they would subsume under biz. So, I mean, if they're saying that, I would assume that unless a specific manuscript from the group they call biz is otherwise cited, then all the other manuscripts of that group fit under the biz designation. Now, that may be correct or not, but I'm not going to tabulate every variant to figure out who may be straying from it. But manuscripts, like I said, with clusters, some will stay with the cluster, some will go out of it. So it's possible. When we're talking about the Byzantine text as a type, though, remember what I said before about Gerd Mink's statement. There's only one text type, and he called it a text type. It's the Byzantine. Now, Klaus actually said the same thing. He said the Byzantine is a type. He said that in German, but he now modifies it, which he did at the conference, to say it's a textual tradition. I'm not sure if that makes much difference, but he did originally say in his book that the Byzantine text is a type. The difference is, we talked about the process view. The idea of a process view really starts with Caldwell, and I deal with this in my paper for the conference, that with Caldwell working on another project, I'm not going to go into all the details of the project, but they were trying to restore an Alexandrian archetype from looking at a common text of all the leading Alexandrian manuscripts. That didn't do well in their experiments, so they cut it down to half of the leading Alexandrian manuscripts, and it still didn't do well, so they abandoned the project. And that led Caldwell to move to the idea of the process. And that is what has been picked up on by Klaus Wachtel, saying that basically the Byzantine text is the result of a long, lengthy process, and he focuses on the latest format of the Byzantine text, which is what von Soden called the KR group. It's what Wilbur Pickering deals into when he goes and favors the Family 35 group. The thing is, the latest result of this process is acknowledged by most people. I think even Klaus would have to acknowledge it, that it's the product of a recension. There was a late recension. Von Soden said 11th or 12th century. Georgy Popolov says that it really should be 13th or 14th because datings were wrong. And so it's either a 12th or 13th or 13th or 14th century process producing this latest form of the text. And so it isn't the result of a process, it's the result of a recension. If you want to see the process, you really need to look at the Byzantine manuscripts that are clearly Byzantine in various degrees, running from the 4th century all the way through the 11th century. There's where, if you're going to look at the process, you see the process. And the one thing that you don't see is the coalescing of the individual Byzantine subgroups all into one text and saying they're all going to come together and finally give you the final result. I have a chart in my paper that shows that you've got the groups like KX, KR, KA, K1, all the different little subgroups of the Byzantine retaining their subgroup identity as they move through time without coalescing. So where is the process? The process that's going on is transmission, but they are retaining their subtext identity in the transmission. So that's why I question why focus on the latest group that's a product of a recension and say somehow that results from the whole 1,000 years of process. I think there is an issue there.
Okay, very interesting. All right, let's move on. So with all this talk about the Byzantine and coming out of the ECM, still using it, did the Byzantine text win out on the text type wars? Did the swirling mass of manuscripts collapse into the singularity of the Byzantine text? Can we think of it in the? I know, Dr. Gurry, you're going to say no. No text type wins. Can you elaborate on that?
Did it win? The battle's ongoing. It seems like, my friend, the fact that we're having this conversation and there are people like Maurice Robinson who continue to write in its defense suggests to me that the battle has not yet been won. I think the Byzantine text will always have its proponents because there's something really satisfying and comforting about a large group of manuscripts that agrees at a high rate. I think that's its notable feature, and it's pretty striking. The fact that it, largely, not entirely, but largely stands behind a venerated translation like the King James, obviously, is always also going to keep certain proponents of it. But no,
Right.
I think there will always be proponents of the Byzantine text. And, in one sense, why shouldn't there be? I'm not one of them. I think, obviously that's not my view, but I don't have, I think there's an unhealthy tendency to think of these traditional text types as somehow at war with each other.
Right.
And my own view is I think that's actually unhealthy for the discipline to think of pitting the text types obviously manuscripts disagree with each other, right? So you're going to have preferred manuscripts. But the fact that I have I have a very short list of manuscripts that I think, man, those are bad manuscripts. Let's sort of put them in the doghouse. Do you know what I mean? The Byzantine manuscripts are not in my doghouse.
Okay.
Codex Beza is probably in my doghouse. Okay, that manuscript is weird, and nobody should be basing their Greek New Testament on Codex Beza, in my opinion. Okay?
That's funny. Yeah.
So, but my list of bad manuscripts is really short. What we have are lots of good manuscripts, and then some manuscripts that are better than others. And then, you have individual, like, again, P72. There's something weird going on in P72, I think. So again,
there was one,
not quite in my doghouse, but it's on its way.
Yeah, there's one manuscript I remember I was looking at a variant, and I can't remember which one it is, and I was like going through and looking at the INTF stuff in the manuscript room, and I forget what manuscript it is. You would know it. And I was like, oh, it's in this manuscript. Like, why is it here? Blah, blah, blah. And then, I was making a big deal about it. Turned out that just recently it was discovered to be a phony. Yeah. It's like, man, I look really dumb. Yeah, that's it. There you go. So Dr. Robinson, did the Byzantine text type win the text type wars?
I don't know that there was a war. to start with, there is no question that the Byzantine text gained dominance. I think you could say that. Now,
Yep.
is that winning? Was it competing against the Western? And did they fight it out? And then that's why it won? No. You've got these independent lines of transmission that are going on, and the Alexandrian would be one line. You've got the Western as another. You could have the Caesarean as another, if we're talking about that, and the Byzantine is another. But as Westcott and Hort themselves said, the Byzantine text, which they call Syrian, but it's the Byzantine text, was dominant, and they said it had basically gained the dominance from the 4th century onward. And they admitted basically by that it overwhelmed in terms of the number of manuscripts being copied, anything that was found among the Alexandrian, the Western, or even the later Caesarean, if you wanted to have that. And it dominated. So, I mean, that's what they were saying. And by the way, on dealing with the manuscripts, we aren't looking from our perspective at all the numbers, where the whole issue of counting noses, which has been raised by various people, Gordon Fee or Dan Wallace or some others, that all we are really doing is counting numbers. The idea is, for our perspective, we don't need to even use 80% of the Byzantine manuscripts that are from the 12th century onward. We eliminate 80% of the Byzantine manuscripts because we can establish what would be the dominant Byzantine text just from the manuscripts from the 4th century through the 11th. And if you even want to say, well, then you're still appealing to a majority of the minuscules, no, eliminate those. Let's just take the Byzantine uncials, and you can still probably get at least about a 95% Byzantine text just from their consensus. So it's not the numbers, it's the text itself that is going on, the text of this Byzantine type. And I'm willing to call it a Byzantine text type because Mink did. So this text has the dominance, and it can be established in high percentage of existence among its membership just from the uncials. And then if you add in the earliest of the minuscules, which probably themselves were copied from earlier uncials that we no longer have any record of, you have sufficient material to establish what was the overall dominant consensus of the Byzantine text type. So I just wanted to make sure we clarify on those points before thinking that we're just looking who wins.
Right.
There's no question about who gained the dominance, but they weren't competing. The Byzantines aren't competing and winning over Alexandrians or Westerns or Caesareans. It just happened to be they gained the dominance. And why would they gain the dominance? Well, that's where Peter will differ from me, because he'll have some other answer. I'll let him answer that. But
Sure.
I suggest they gain the dominance because they are dominant from the get-go. And you have to remember that even if you're looking at the Alexandrian text, which is, let's just say for purposes, the Nestle-Aland text is mostly equivalent to the Alexandrian text. The Nestle-Aland text agrees in its basic agreement with the Byzantine 94%. We're only talking about 6% where
Right.
the Nestle-Aland UBS text would disagree from the Byzantine. So we're not talking a great deal. There is this common text held by all of the other text types with the Byzantine. And this is what I termed, and I made a point of this in my paper, and I'm in the revision that I'm doing now, it's going to even be a stronger emphasis on it. You're dealing with a common core of text that is starting out with, agreed with basically by everybody.
Everybody.
And then after that, some disagreements from the core, which will characterize these separate, smaller clusters. So that's just for clarification purposes.
Very good. Very good.